Welcome to Outside the Circle. Now, I know last week was a lot of information, so thanks for sticking out with me. I promise it'll all be worth it at the end of the session. I set the stage for a lot of things that we're going to kind of explore and go through over the next couple weeks, and so it's all going to kind of come together. So I hope you can kind of hold on to some of that and show how it all connects down the road. But don't worry, today is not a history lesson. In fact, this one has some fun action in this one, actually, really. Um, Today's story might be familiar to most of you, no matter whether you've been in church for 25 years or really 25 minutes. Honestly, in fact, really at the end of the day, many people who haven't even stepped foot in church know this story, at least the essence of the story, simply because it's used a lot, especially if you're a sports fan. This metaphor is used almost every year for the underdog taking on an impossible task type situation. Um, I know as a football guy, you hear it almost all the time, and so it's just one of those things. It's used mostly for this idea of a underdog taking on this imposing, impossible, you know, team or whatever in the sense of sports. Um, and so yeah, so if you don't know what I'm talking about, we're talking about David versus Goliath today, the ultimate underdog story. In fact, most of us probably know a lot of good examples of David versus Goliath, whether it be in sports or literature and movies. I mean, you have the most famous Miracle on Ice in the 1980s with the U.S. hockey team beating out the Soviet Union. WrestleMania 3 with Hulk Hogan versus Andre the Giant. The Rebellion versus the Empire in Star Wars, for crying out loud. For football folks, Super Bowl 42 with the Giants and the Patriots. I mean, that was a crazy one. Rocky versus Drago in Rocky 4. Buster Douglas versus Mike Tyson back with their fight in the 90s. Even one of my favorites, Frodo versus Mordor in Lord of the Rings. Like, the list goes on and on. I mean, these are just a few examples to kind of get your brain going if any of those kind of come to mind. And so, um, but bottom line, at the end of the day, it's just a story of an underdog versus an unbeatable task. But the question becomes, was David really the underdog here? I mean, let's look at the tail of the tape. So you have Goliath on one side and David on the other. Goliath was from Gath, David was from Bethlehem. Goliath stood at 9 feet and 9 inches tall, is what most people think. In scripture, it was cubits, so trying to figure out what a cubit was has been a fun task, but most Bible scholars and historians would say that Goliath was about 9 foot. Most of them agree that David probably stood about 5'5", 5'6", about average for the time. Goliath had armor that weighed 125 pounds. David, well, David didn't even have armor at all. So Goliath had a spear that weighed 15 pounds. David had a sling with 5 smooth stones. Goliath was the Philistine champion. And David was a shepherd boy that, as we learned last week, even his own dad didn't give credit when it came to Samuel saying, hey, the next king is in your midst, in your house, Jesse. And even Jesse was like, well, don't call David in. He's not worth it. But as we see, that was not the case. So, Goliath's X Factor? Really, he's a giant. I mean, that's what he's got going for him. He's a giant. He's a big, imposing force. Probably like 400, 500 pounds is what most historians come to the conclusion of. So being a giant kind of helps you in the long run. But David's X factor is that he had God confidence. And that's the big change. So, but when you look at it seems like a little bit of a lopsided matchup, really. But let's see how we got here, right? Like, let's actually dig into this. So, the story of David versus Goliath can be found in 1 Samuel 17, right after where we were kind of reading last week. Now, this does have 58 verses, but we ain't reading all of them. There's a lot. I do recommend reading it in your own time because there is a lot of great details to notice within the story that we don't always get told, especially in kids' church growing up. There's a lot of things that they definitely kind of skim over because, again, who's going to keep a kid entertained for 58 verses? So, you know, is what it is. But again, I do recommend reading in your own time. But for now, we're just going to kind of hop around a little bit and get kind of the core premise of the message. So, what we come up on is the Philistines meet the Israelites on this battlefield. And back then, there was kind of this rule. I say rule, I guess a code of combat or whatever you want to call it. But the general premise was that you would send out a champion and do one-on-one battle, and that way you're not wasting your whole forces fighting a fight. So it's like, hey, you send out a guy, we send out a guy. If you win, we'll be your servants. If we win, we'll be your whatever, vice versa. And so that's what they did. So, of course, the Philistines thought this played in their favor because, lo and behold, the Philistines bring out Goliath. They bring Goliath to the table to say, hey, this is our champion. You find a guy who can beat him, go for it. So in verse 4 to 7 of 1 Samuel 16, we actually kind of see a description of who Goliath was. That we already kind of talked about in the tail of the tape, so I won't really read into it, but you can definitely check that out in your free time. Again, a lot of it's what we discussed there, but it does go into a little bit more details with a few things. But I do want us to go ahead and go to verse 8 and start there with our reading today. So 1 Samuel 17, verse 8. This is referring to Goliath. It says, he stood and shouted to the Israelite battle formations. Why do you come out to line up in battle formation? He asked them. Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose one of your men and have him come down to me. If he wins the fight against me and kills me, we will be your servants. But if I win against him and kill him, then you will be our servants and serve us. Then the Philistines said, I defy the ranks of Israel today. Send me a man who can fight, so we can fight each other. When Saul and all Israel heard these words from the Philistines, they lost their courage and were terrified. So again, Goliath just throws down the gauntlet right there, right? Simple, you beat me, we'll be your servants, but I beat you, and you belong to us. Seems simple, right? Well, maybe, but Goliath was a 9-foot tall man who weighed probably about 400 or 500 pounds. So maybe not such an easy fight, right? In fact, no one in the Israelite army would even dare step out to face Goliath. Not even David's 3 older brothers that we find out are actually at this matchup, I guess so to say. This fight, this conflict. And that's actually where David comes in. So let's read on. We're going to skip down to verse 16. It says, every morning and evening for 40 days, the Philistine came forward and took his stand. I just want to point that out. This happened for 40 days. For 40 days, Goliath would come out, say all this nonsense about like, hey, come challenge me. Get out here. Aren't you, supposed to be Saul's folks? I'm, just a Philistine. Come fight me, basically. 40 days this happened, and for 40 days, Israelites just were like, yeah, I'm going to not do that. Also, while I'm saying this out loud, 40 days is kind of interesting. I feel like there might be something there, but that's a discussion for another day. But anyway, so every morning and evening for 40 days, the Philistine came forward and took his stand. One day, Jesse had told his son David, take this half bushel of roasted grain along with these 10 loaves of bread for your brothers and hurry to their camp. Also take these 10 portions of cheese to the field commander. Check on the well-being of your brothers and bring a confirmation from them. They are with Saul and all the men of Israel in the valley of Elah, fighting with the Philistines. So David got up early in the morning, left his flock with someone to keep it, loaded up, and set out as Jesse had charged him. He arrived at the perimeter of the camp as the army was marching out to its battle formation, shouting their battle cry. Israel and the Philistines lined up in battle formation, facing each other. David left his supplies in the care of the quartermaster and ran to the battle line. When he arrived, he asked his brothers how they were. While he was speaking with them, suddenly the champion named Goliath, the Philistine from Gath, came forward from the Philistine battle line and shouted his usual words, which David heard. When all the Israelite men saw Goliath, they retreated from him, terrified. So here David is coming out to see his brothers, to bring them food and ask how they're doing. But he kind of gets an unexpected surprise when he's there. Actually, a pretty large unexpected surprise at that, with Goliath. Large enough that all the Israelite army was, cowering in fear from. But David kind of has a different response, which is what we'll see in verse 26. David spoke to these men who were standing with him. What will be done for the man who kills that Philistine and removes the disgrace from Israel? Just who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? First and foremost, I just kind of want to say this. Uncircumcised Philistine just feels like such a dirty insult, and it kind of is, and that's kind of the point of what David's doing. I mean, it was very much a backhanded, like, who is this uncircumcised Philistine? And honestly, I feel like putting that one in my back pocket and using that whenever I just want to insult someone. Not that I should insult people, but at the same time, I mean, if I'm going to insult someone, just be like, hey, you uncircumcised Philistine. Like, I just feel like that's just mean, And then, you might want to say that for a rainy day. Maybe it's just me. Probably shouldn't do that. We should love people. But, sometimes you got to call them an uncircumcised Philistine. It happens. Anywho, that's not the point here. I digress. But what we do see here is that David's furious with Goliath. Again, I mean, to the point of, you uncircumcised Philistine. I mean, that's about as upset as you can get. Again, kind of almost feels like he's cursing him out or something, But we have to kind of ask, why is he upset? And actually, it says it quite clearly there. It's because Goliath defied God. That's all that David saw. I mean, he's very intentional of just being like, oh, you uncircumcised Philistine, what's wrong with you? Why are we just sitting here? This guy is in defiance of God. What are we doing, basically? He didn't see Goliath's size or armor or even his weapons. He just saw someone standing there defying God, and he grew angry. And this isn't just a regular anger. This is very much what we would call righteous anger. It's a similar anger you kind of see when Jesus flips tables in the gospel. It's not just about being angry because something's going on, but it's a righteous anger, especially because it's an anger about God. With Jesus in the temple, it was very much being upset over the fact that, they were desecrating God's temple and what God designed it for. If you listen to the Holy Week section, if I remember correctly, I believe the storming of the temple was Monday, if I remember correctly. That's exactly what we talked about, is Jesus was upset because they had turned this house of prayer into, a den of thieves, as he puts it. And it's the same thing here with David. He's very much saying, this man is out here defying God, mocking God, acting like, Israel, who's supposed to be God's people, are basically cowards. And that upsets David. He says, this man is talking about God the way he does. Why are you just sitting here and not doing a thing about it, basically? And so again, very similar mindsets with this righteous anger of saying, God is good, God is amazing, and y'all are not doing what y'all are supposed to, basically. In fact, over the next few verses, he even gets upset with his own brothers, because really he and his older brother Eliab actually kind of get into a heated exchange. And Eliab is just very much like, David, go home. Now, this is kind of just scripture, according to me, so don't take it as fact, but I feel like you got a Joseph type situation going on here. If you go back to the story of Joseph, for those who know it, Joseph was the favorite of his dad, gets his coat of many colors, and the older brothers are like, oh, the baby of the group, like dad's favorite. They get really jealous and upset. You can't tell me that's not going on here. I mean, especially with these three boys going off to war, they're definitely more. I'm not gonna say they're alpha male types, but they're probably alpha male types, so to say. And here you have lowly David, who's just a shepherd boy. Samuel walks in and is like, not you, not you, not you, not you. Hey, little shepherd boy, you're gonna be the next king of Israel. You can't tell me that didn't weigh on them. You know what I'm saying? Like I'm kind of being careful about reading into the text, but I mean, there's a part of me that feels like that definitely was a thing. And then all of a sudden, David's coming here, and they've been cowering in fear for 40 days, as it showed earlier. And all of a sudden, David's like, "Why aren't we doing something? Somebody go take care of this man." And I feel like this exchange between Eliab and him is very much like, David, stop causing issues, stop being controversial, stop being entitled, I guess, whatever. It's like, just go home. This is men's work. Go home. Like, I feel like he was just probably beyond done with him. And I mean, who could blame him? Again, mildly trying to be very careful of reading in the text, but I do feel like there's probably some level of, jealousy and, just being upset that, like, oh, this is supposed to be the next king of Israel, and now here he is being like this. Like, get out of here, dude. Like, stop. Just stop. You're not the main character. Even though he very much is. But anywho, so King Saul kind of hears this dispute, or hears of this dispute, and so he actually tells him, like, hey, call David to me, basically. And so he calls David, and David kind of shares the same sentiment of, like, what are we doing about this? Like, Goliath is out here mocking God, and we're just sitting here. And Saul ends up really loving his tenacity at the end of the day. But he did believe David was too young for the task, and so he's like, I can't send a kid out there, basically. And so in verse 34, we actually see David's response to this. It says, David answered Saul, your servant has been tending his father's sheep. Whenever a lion or a bear came and carried off a lamb from the flock, I went after it, struck it down, and rescued the lamb from its mouth. If it reared up against me, I would grab it by its fur, strike it down, and kill it. Your servant has killed lions and bears. This uncircumcised Philistine, there's that phrase again, I love it. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. So, I love, if you look at both earlier, when he gets upset originally, it talks about the fact that he has defied the armies of the living God. And he says the same thing here to Saul, when he literally says, where'd it go? For he has defied the armies of the living God. Once again, he's very much saying, like, this is what's upsetting me. This is what's angering me. He is defying the armies of the living God, which I love, especially when you think Philistines, because, like, he's being very clear, like, we serve the one true living God. You're serving fake idols and other things like that. And so it's like, you are in open defiance of the living God. And David's like, I'm not going to stand for it, And even to Saul, he's saying that. And so the confidence that David has is just awesome, But that's what true faith in God looks like, Because, see, David didn't just have blind faith in God. This wasn't just like a hope and a wish on a prayer, basically, type thing. You know what I'm saying? Like, David had true faith and trust in God and who God is. And it's not just any type of trust. It's trust based on experience from what we see in his own words. I mean, David's clear, like, look, I faced off against a bear and a lion, and God has delivered me from both of them. Both times he came out victorious. So he not only had faith that God could do it, he had true trust built on experience of saying, God has come through time and time again, and so I trust that he'll do it once again. And see, it kind of helps if you're in David's spot, because remember, God sent Samuel to anoint David as the next king. And so David not only is holding true to his experience of, hey, God's always come through for me, I know he'll come through again. But David also was resting in God's promise. He held firm to this promise from God and knew that if God said it, it would happen. And God said, you're the next anointed king of Israel. And David knew it would take place. So not only did he have confidence in God's promise to him, he had confidence in God's, like he had trust and faith in God for delivering him time and time again, and says, look, he's done it once, he'll do it again. And I know he will do it again. You know, that's like, this is God confidence at its finest, you know. In fact, over the next few verses, we see that he was so confident in God and his promise that when Saul offered him his armor, he actually rejected it. He's like, bro, this is weighing me down. I don't need it. You know? I mean, that's crazy. To know you're about to go face this giant that's as big and imposing and has, 125-pound armor, he's like, nah, man, I'm good, you know? All he does, goes out, gets 5 stones, and heads out to the battlefield. And then he meets Goliath on the battlefield. Both armies on a hill. In the middle of this valley stand David and Goliath. The highly anticipated main event has finally arrived. The irresistible force meeting the immovable object. But first, there's a little bit of smack talk. I mean, what's a great fight without a little bit of smack talk, right? Go me to verse 42. When the Philistine looked and saw David, he despised him because he was just a youth, healthy and handsome. Aw, it said he was handsome. That's sweet. He said to David, am I a dog that you come against me with sticks? Then he cursed David by his gods. Come here, the Philistine called to David, and I will give you flesh to the birds of the sky and the wild beasts. David said to the Philistine, you come against me with a sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord of armies, the God of the ranks of Israel. You have defied him. Today the Lord will hand you over to me. Today I will strike you down, remove your head, and give your corpse to the Philistine camp, or of the Philistine camp, to the birds of the sky and the wild creatures of the earth. Then all the world will know that Israel has a God. And this whole assembly will know that it is not by sword or by spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's. He will hand you over to us. This is very much not the same level of trash talk. Like, I'm a pro wrestling fan. I've seen plenty of great promos, and Goliath was alright. It was a little shaky. Just like, hey, look, you're a dog coming at me with sticks. Like, come on, man. You're tiny. You're a youth. Basically, I pick children out of you, or I pick small people like you out of my teeth after breakfast. You know what I'm saying? Like, whatever. I don't know. And so Goliath was very much like, just look, wow, you're this little guy. But David was firm. I mean, David was flat out like, look, you got some big weapons, and you got some nice ones, but you stand against God. And because of that, you will fall. I mean, David's very clear that God will hand you over to me, and that all the world will know that Israel has a God. I mean, see, David knew what no one else in Israel seemed to know. See, they saw an immovable object in Goliath, but David knew that God was the irresistible force that could break through any object, no matter how unmovable it may seem. And when he does this, like David said, everyone will know that there is a God in Israel. I mean, wow. Come on. That's the level of confidence he has, knowing that God will remove this immovable object. He had that confidence. In fact, look at the next verse with verse 48. When the Philistines started forward to attack him, look what it says. David ran quickly to the battlefield to meet the Philistines. Notice what it says? He ran what? Quickly towards the fight. No hesitation. He ran full force at Goliath. But let's keep reading. Right? Go back to 48. When the Philistines started toward to attack him, David ran quickly to the battlefield to meet the Philistine. David put his hand in the bag, took out a stone, slung it, and hit the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down to the ground. David defeated the Philistine with a sling and a stone. David overpowered the Philistine and killed him without having a sword. David ran and stood over him. He grabbed the Philistine's sword, pulled it from its sheath, and used it to kill him. Then he cut off his head. When the Philistines saw that their hero was dead, they fled. Ring the bell, the match is over. One decisive blow took the giant down. That's the power of a man backed by God. Then here's the part they don't really tell you in kids' church. Kind of understand why, but David cuts his head off. Like David cuts Goliath's head off. Come on. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have a winner, and that's David. And we actually see the spoils from this if you go down to verse 54. It says, David took Goliath's head and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put Goliath's weapons in his own tent. So he kept that sword and stuff. He's like, man, these weapons, they go into my place, like going up on my wall, basically. No, not really, but still. But that's pretty cool if you ask me. In fact, it talks about him taking the head. There are theories out there. I'm not saying you should subscribe to them, not saying you shouldn't. I'm just going to put the theory out there, and you do with it what you wish. But there are theories out there that David would have taken the head of Goliath back to Jerusalem with him, which was customary of the time. But he wouldn't have let it go into the holy city of Jerusalem, especially because he was a uncircumcised Philistine. And but the idea would have been that they would have taken a stake, placed it outside, and placed the head on this stake, kind of to show everybody around there that, hey, we killed Goliath, basically. Like, you can come to us, but look what we did. Again, the whole world will know that there's a God in Israel. And, or that Israel has a God, I guess. It's better phrasing because that is what it says. But anyways, and so the idea was that he would have taken Goliath's head, put it on the stake right outside the city. Rumor has it, again, this is where the theory comes in, not saying I believe it, not saying you should or shouldn't believe it, but it is something interesting to think on. And it basically says that that's where the word Golgotha comes from in the New Testament, the place where Jesus was crucified. It's called Golgotha, the place of the skull. People correlate it by saying Goliath. His skull could have been placed there because they would have placed the head on the spike. Again, not saying you should subscribe to it, not saying you shouldn't. Just food for thought, something fun to kind of think on. But there's no confirmation one way or the other. But it's a fun little fact to think, especially because you could, if you think along those logical lines of, hey, David put the head of this giant that seemed impossible to defeat, and yet here's where he stuck it after the victory, and to know that Christ was crucified there, which is where he crushed sin and Satan. And so, kind of beating what seems impossible of cleansing men of their sin. So it's a fun thing to think on. Again, not going to say one way or the other, but just something fun to think on. But again, I digress. But again, we see the spoils. Again, he keeps the sword for himself. Like his, I mean, it says that he puts his weapons in his own tent. So that nice 15-pound spear is now in David's possession. And that brings us to an end of one of, if not the most iconic matchup of all time. So what does all this really mean at the end of the day? Well, there's a couple things. So the big key is this, that David didn't have war experience. He didn't have the best sword or spear. He didn't even have armor. You know, the latter of two, as far as the sword or spear and the armor, I mean, literally offered by Saul, like, hey, take my armor. You know, the king's armor at that. You know, no more prestigious armor than the king's, right? But David turned it down. Instead, David knew what God had equipped him with, you know. He took his sling and his stones to a sword fight. It's kind of like taking a knife to a gunfight. It seems like it's an unfair matchup. But God had been raising David for this fight, and David knew that. I mean, the lion, the bear, the experience he's had with a sling, David used what God had given him to take on his challenger. He didn't try some fancy new thing. He didn't, you know, want the new and the, oh, hey, the king's armor. Nah, he said, this is what God's always gotten me through. I've had a sling and a stone, and I've had a bear and a lion step up to me, and God's delivered me from both with this. Plus, tactically speaking, it actually helped out because the sling kept him a further distance, which means he could strike from a distance, which kind of works when you're facing a giant like that. So tactically made sense. But even then, David used what God had given him, you know? And kind of going back to what was said earlier about, you know, David didn't just have a simple faith, like a hope and a wish on a star, you know. I mean, David was the example. I mean, this is what a life built on God confidence looks like, you know. It's saying, I know what God's done, and I know that He'll do it again. And again, it's built through this experience, you know. It's one step at a time of remembering what God's done. If we go back, especially with Exodus and a little bit after that, you see these phrases put all the time where it's like the God of, you know, Jacob and Isaac and stuff like that, the God who delivered us from Egypt. You know, it's like that constant reminder that, hey, remember when God did this, remember when God did that. And I think that's a lot of times why we don't have the faith to do things is because we forget what God's already done for us, you know? And so it's like God's gotten us through so many murky waters, but then we find our Goliath, so to say, and it's like, oh yeah, well, this is where we end. It's like, why? You know, why aren't we like David? Well, remember the lion and the bear? Well, God delivered me from that, so Goliath ain't nothing. Yeah, he's a little bit bigger and seems more insurmountable, but God's always been there. You know, God's got me through it. He'll get me through it again, you know. Man, I mean, to have God confidence like that, like that's the dream. That's the goal. You know, I think that's what we should strive for. And a lot of that is, again, like David, saying, I know your promises. I know what you've already done. And I know you'll do it again. Because I'm your child, and I know you're not going to leave me. I know you will always make a way for me, whatever that looks like. See, David was just a boy with a sling and a stone, but he had the heart of a lion, and that drove him to stand his ground before a giant and say, you're big, but my God is bigger. Man, we should aspire for that. We really should try to emulate that. All right. Thanks for listening, guys. We'll see you next time.